Welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. Today on the Jazz Update, we're going to be talking about jazz piano virtuoso Oscar Peterson. He grew up in Montreal where he started out playing the piano at a young age. By 14, he'd started out professional. Peterson went on to be known as the master of swing with his incredible speed and technique on the keyboard. Duke Ellington once called him the Maharaja of the keyboard. Over his career, Peterson won 7 Grammy Awards and was inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. He's got over 200 recordings to his name like Oscar Peterson Plays Duke Ellington, Night Train, Oscar Peterson's Jazz Portrait of Frank Sinatra, and more. So on today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update, we're going to be talking in depth about Oscar Peterson, his life and times and best albums. Also coming up some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva to find out more. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times and best dates of jazz icon Oscar Peterson. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about his biography. So Oscar Peterson was one of the leading jazz composers and pianists of his time. He was famous for his technique on the keyboard that incorporated speed, dexterity, and swinging rhythms. He was widely hailed as the master of swing. He saw his peak in the 50s with more than 200 albums to his credit. He also had numerous collaborations with other artists like Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie, Billie Holiday, and others. Some of his best-known compositions were songs like Hymn to Freedom and Canadiana Suite. He won 7 Grammy Awards and a Juno Award, also a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He was later inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame and the International Jazz Hall of Fame. So Oscar Peterson grew up in Montreal, the fourth of 5 children. His first exposure to music was playing the church organ where his father was a musician. He took up trumpet and piano playing at a young age. He went on to study piano playing at the age of 14. He was mainly influenced by jazz pianists like Nat King Cole, Teddy Wilson and Art Tatum. He emerged a celebrity in Montreal in the 40s. In 1987, he dropped out of school to pursue a full-time career in piano alongside Jimmy Holmes' dance band. His first recordings were made for Victor Records in the mid-40s, mainly boogie woogie and bebop tracks. These early recordings showcased his speed on the piano and foreshadowed things to come. His success during these early years further cemented his status as a jazz icon in Canada. He also began to tour Canada at the time. In 1947, he began his own trio, himself on piano, Austin Roberts on bass, and Clarence Jones on drums. By the end of the 40s, he'd become known internationally in the US. In 1949, he performed at the Carnegie Hall in New York alongside other jazz greats like Charlie Parker, Lester Young, and Roy Aldridge. His performance was massively successful and kick-started his journey as a jazz icon in the US. So here's some highlights from his career. He toured with the Jazz Philharmonic Orchestra from 1950 to 1952, sparking an interest in his unique style across the US. He was awarded first place in the Downbeat magazine Readers' Poll in the piano category 15 times during the 50s through the 70s. In 1950, he signed up to Verve Records, where he started performing alongside Ray Brown as bassist. One of their early recordings, the song Tenderly, was a massive success. In 1953, Herb Ellis and Barney Kessel joined the Peterson Trio. That band, featuring Peterson, Ellis and Brown, went on to be known as one of the greatest jazz trios in history. They were known for their fast-paced tracks, spontaneous and passionate solo performances, among other things. Throughout the 50s, Peterson and his trio toured Europe and Japan, making several notable performances at jazz festivals like the Montreal Jazz Festival, the Stratford Jazz Festival, and more. 2 of his famous album releases taken from these live tours were Oscar Peterson at the Stratford Shakespearean Festival in 1956 and On the Town, recorded in 1958. In 1958, Herb Ellis left the Peterson Trio, was replaced by Ed Thigpen, who was famous for his sensitive style of drumming. The Peterson Trio also switched to piano, bass and drums and were renowned for their synchronicity during their performances. In 1962, the trio recorded one of their most successful albums ever, Night Train. Canadiana Suite, recorded in 1964, was a follow-up. In 1965, Thigpen and Brown left his band to be replaced by Louis Hayes on drums and Sam Jones on bass. In the 70s, Peterson also began several solo tours. In 1972, he formed another trio alongside guitarist Joe Pass and bassist Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen. In the 70s, he saw critical acclaim and was awarded 4 Grammys for his albums The Trio, The Giants, Oscar Peterson and the Trumpet Kings, and Montreux 77. In 1987, another album, If You Could See Me Now, was awarded a Juno Award. Oscar Peterson died in December 2007, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest jazz pianists in history. So that was a bit about Oscar Peterson's biography, and on this week's episode of the Jazz Update, we're talking all about Oscar Peterson, his life and times and best albums. Also coming up, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva to find out more. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Oscar Peterson, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time to talk about some trending album news. Jazz icon Kirk Whalem's out with a new album release. It's called Epic Cool, and it's his first album release after 5 years. So this album compiles a compilation of Kirk Whalem's songs, giving us a glimpse into his style and flair. The story behind the name of this album is interesting. According to Whalem, one of his friends listened to the songs and said, "This is Epic Cool," and the name stuck. So Epic Cool is a compilation of songs that are cool, groovy and energetic. The songs reflect his personal experiences. The first song, for instance, Badi Ya. That's a song about overcoming obstacles and accomplishing milestones in life, from performing alongside Whitney Houston to standing on stage alongside Nelson Mandela. Pillow Talk is an abstract song. Whalem says he just wrote the melody and the lyrics on a whim. It was merely spur-of-the-moment ideas. Crusadation is a tribute song to one of his favorite bands, the Crusaders. That's a band that comprises jazz, R&B and blues. So the new album sees Whalem collaborating with composer, producer and songwriter Greg Manning, who he first met as a keyboardist in South Africa. The band also features several of Whalem's family. His son Kyle's on bass, his nephews Cameron and Kenneth are on trombone and saxophone. So the album Epic Cool is going up for grabs on May 17, 2024. You can purchase the album on any digital streaming platform of your choice. So that was some trending album news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Oscar Peterson's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz pianist Oscar Peterson. On this hour, it's about his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be talking about. The first album is called Oscar Peterson Plays Duke Ellington, released in 1952. This one's an all-star cast of piano virtuosos, and they are performing renditions, a tribute album to one of the greatest jazz composers in history, Duke Ellington. The next album is called Night Train, released in 1963. On this album, Peterson is on keyboard, Ray Brown on bass, and Ed Thigpen on drums. Many of the songs in this album are jazz classics like Georgia on My Mind, I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good, and so forth. And an album called Nigerian Marketplace, released in 1981. This album was recorded during one of Peterson's performances at the Montreux Jazz Festival. So this album was recorded as part of a series of recordings called Africa Suite. So that was a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be talking about on this hour. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva to find out more. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz pianist Oscar Peterson. On this hour, it's about his best albums of all time. The first album is called Oscar Peterson Plays Duke Ellington, released in 1952. This one's an all-star cast of piano virtuosos, and they're performing renditions, a tribute album to one of the greatest jazz composers in history, Duke Ellington. Most of the recordings in this album are taken from 1970 and 80 versions of Peterson's albums. There's also tracks from a couple of albums Peterson recorded in the 50s, an album called Oscar Peterson Plays the Duke Ellington Songbook. This album is full of fast-paced tracks like Cottontail, a collaboration with Joe Pass, Neil Orsted and Martin Drew. His brilliance as a solo pianist comes across in the tracks Lady of the Lavender Mist and I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good. On the track Things Ain't What They Used to Be, we see his passion for blues melodies. He's joined by Dizzy Gillespie, Clark Terry and Eddie Davis on this track. The next album is called Night Train, released in 1963. On this album, Peterson is on keyboard, Ray Brown on bass and Ed Thigpen on drums. Brown is at his best with the solos and the rhythm section, while Thigpen keeps time. And then there's Peterson, the star of the band. His playing is graceful yet lightning-paced. For example, the track Sea Jam Blues. It's a very complicated piece, full of difficult runs and ornamentals. And that's one of the cornerstones of Peterson's piano style. He could take any piano piece, however complicated, and make it appear simple to play. Another song, The Honey Dripper, with a rapid bass and twinkling arpeggios. This one's a song that immediately draws the listener to the music while they're entranced by Peterson's rendition of the melody. So that's because many of the songs are jazz classics that the audience are familiar with, like Georgia on My Mind, I Got It Bad and That Ain't Good, and so forth. Probably the best song in the album is the song Hymn to Freedom. The song starts off slowly with Peterson on piano and then his trio join him halfway through. So Night Train is pure Peterson perfection. It has all the elements of traditional and free jazz. It's a perfect blend for Peterson's piano playing as he blazes his way through the keyboard and also showcases his ear for music. An album called Nigerian Marketplace, released in 1981. At this point, Peterson had been playing professionally for 40 years. This album was recorded during one of his performances at the Montreux Jazz Festival. It showcases his development as a musician and pianist. So this album was recorded as part of a series of recordings called Africa Suite, features some classic tracks like Misty and Waltz for Debbie, Cakewalk, one of his original compositions, also Nigerian Marketplace, his debut track on this album. So that was a compilation of some of Oscar Peterson's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We'll wait for a short break, we'll be right back after that. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, it's about Oscar Peterson, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time to talk about some trending festival news. The New Orleans Jazz Festival is currently going on. It started on Thursday. It's got some exciting names on the lineup, including the Rolling Stones. The New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival spans 2 weekends. This year's event, started on Thursday, features dozens of acts on 14 stages across the Fairgrounds Racecourse in New Orleans. So this festival basically celebrates the music heritage of Louisiana, and acts at the festival span rock, blues, jazz, R&B, Latin and more. The highlight of this event are the Rolling Stones. They're going to be performing next Thursday, May 2nd. This is the first time the Rolling Stones will be performing. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to get them to perform in 2019, they had to postpone their appearance at the show after Mick Jagger suffered health issues. Then again in 2021 due to COVID restrictions. Other acts that have already performed on this year's lineup include rock bands Widespread Panic, the Beach Boys, and reggae artist Stephen Marley. The first weekend showcases more talent, performances by Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter Jon Batiste, R&B star Fantasia, jazz piano sensation Patrice Rushen, and more. So this one's a great festival to attend, featuring an exciting roundup of music and food festivities. For more information, please visit www.nojazzfest.com. And that was a bit of trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Oscar Peterson's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.